What are the secrets of House Stark's Valyrian steel blade, Ice? What is its history, who has wielded it, and might it somehow return later in the story? Hi everyone, this is Robert. Welcome to In Deep Geek. On this channel we cover the world of A Song of Ice and Fire in depth, as well as The Lord of the Rings, The Witcher, and more. Welcome. This is another collaboration with the excellent History of Westeros. Please do check out their YouTube channel and podcast. There's a link in the description. During the prologue to A Game of Thrones, Garrett, a 40-year-old veteran ranger, flees the others and then the Night's Watch when his companions Sir Waymar Royce and the POV character Will are killed. In the next chapter, Bran and his brothers witness the subsequent execution of Garrett by their father, with their family's ancestral greatsword Ice. It is central to one of the opening images for the whole story. Bran describes Ice as spell-forged and dark as smoke. This is not childish fancy on Bran's part. Valyrian steel is indeed spell-forged, and the secrets of the spells that forged it were apparently lost when the Doom came to Valyria. It is 6 feet tall, nearly 2 meters, wide across as a man's hand, and like all great swords, it is meant to be wielded with both hands. That the blade is dark and smoky is an important detail, as the TV show did not make Valyrian steel look much different to regular steel, so Ice and the other Valyrian steel blades on HBO were not dark in colour like they typically are in the books. In the chapter immediately after the execution, Catelyn also takes note of Ice, thinking she could see the rippling deep within the steel, where the metal had been folded back on itself 100 times in the forging. Catelyn had no love for swords, but she could not deny that Ice had its own beauty. Catelyn found Ned cleaning Ice in the Godswood, something he always does after an execution, and something perhaps done by many other Lord Starks before him. Just as Starks believe he who passes the sentence should swing the sword, Lord Eddard apparently believed the duty of wiping off the blood should fall to the wielder as well. It's not unlikely he learned this from his father too. There would be no need for any Stark to personally sharpen the sword, however. Nothing holds an edge like Valyrian steel. However, that was not always the case for the Starks. House Stark has owned this Valyrian steel blade since about 400 years before the reign of Robert Baratheon. In other words, this was one of the last blades to make it out of Valyria before the Doom, perhaps even the last, a curious historical oddity that may or may not be pure happenstance. We don't have any more information to go on. Anyway, before that, there was a different sword, also called Ice, which was not made of Valyrian steel. Cat recalls that the name it, Ice, bore was older still, a legacy from the Age of Heroes when the Starks were kings in the north. Which would have made that a truly ancient sword, thousands of years old. You have to wonder what happened to it, although the boring answer is probably simply that, as Cat says, the name survived from the Age of Heroes and was passed down from sword to sword. The sword we know as Ice is simply the latest of many swords given that name. Whatever the truth of that, there is an undoubted poetry to the kings of winter having a sword called Ice that dispensed winter's judgment and justice. We don't know the circumstances of how the Ice we know was acquired from the Valyrians, but the time frame corresponds with the era when Valyrian steel began to flow into the Seven Kingdoms in notable amounts. In the absence of any other evidence, the most likely answer is simply that the Starks bought it from the Valyrians, like many other noble houses of the time. House Mormont got Longclaw perhaps 100 years before the Starks got Ice, for example. Lady Forlorn, the Valyrian steel blade of House Corbray in the Vale, is another interesting comparator, because that too had a predecessor with the same name that was not Valyrian steel. The difference in that case is that both the current and original Lady Forlorn were frequently used in battle. Such is not the case with Ice. This is simply because of its great size. A 6-foot-long sword is difficult to wield in battle unless you are a very large person. Ned Stark, for example, was not particularly large and did not fight with Ice. Now, sword nerds, I know it's not impossible to fight with a sword of that length, and Valyrian steel is noticeably lighter and therefore more manageable than normal steel, but for most, if not all, Starks, this particular sword seems to have been reserved for ceremonial occasions such as executions. One possible exception to this is a Stark lord called Barthagon, who spent much of his time fighting rebellion by the Isle of Skagos and earned the moniker Black Sword. Ice is a dark colour, so perhaps he was a rare Stark with the physical capability and willingness to wield ice in battle, but most of the time it only tasted blood at executions. And of course, in what amounts to a very dark bookend, Ned's arguably unjust execution of Garrett early in the book is paralleled by his own unjust execution by Ilyn Payne on the sudden orders of King Joffrey. In both cases, ice was the killing blade. Arya didn't see the blow that killed her father because Euron covered her eyes, but when she saw the red comet, she pictured ice covered in her father's blood, so she apparently saw Sir Ilyn holding the sword aloft afterwards. Sir Ilyn continued to carry the blade for some time, and Sansa, who did see her father die, began to have nightmares of him coming to execute her with ice as well. She is menaced by his frequent presence throughout A Clash of Kings, including during the Battle of the Blackwater, where he stands ready to execute with ice those who flee. In fact, he does execute 3 servants under Cersei's orders. Afterwards, he didn't clean the blood from ice, matching the imagery of the comet as seen by Arya. Almost 250 years prior to Lord Eddard's death, however, his ancestor Lord Walton Stark rode to the wall for an execution. Unlike Ned, he rode to bring justice to a traitor instead of a deserter. The condemned, Sir Oliver Bracken, had served under King Maegor the Cruel and took the Black when the crown passed to King Jaehaerys. He led a revolt against the Night's Watch, but lost his head to ice. It's not for this video, but it's worth noting the implicit relationship here, therefore, between the Starks and the Night's Watch. The Stark Lord doesn't just have a paternalistic care for the Night's Watch, helping them out when needed, as we sometimes absent-mindedly think, but in fact dispenses justice on their behalf to those who abandon their vows. That's a position of authority, not just friendship. One of the most famous wielders of the sword was Lord Cregan Stark during the Dance of the Dragons. He and his forces arrived in King's Landing right at the end of the war, and he immediately restored order in the battered city, in what became known as the Hour of the Wolf. He executed 2 traitors, Larys Strong and Kingsguard Knight Sir Giles Belgrave, with ice. But to return to the main story, when Lord Tywin Lannister arrived in King's Landing to retake his position as Hand of the King, he quickly stripped Sir Ilyn Payne of ice. House Lannister had lost their Valyrian steel blade Brightroar some centuries prior, and Tywin's own brother Geryon went to seek it out, but was never seen again. Robb Stark had tried to negotiate for ice's return to House Stark, but the Lannisters drove a hard bargain and perhaps never intended to reach an accord. Tywin may not have shared his brother's willingness to sail around the world to find a lost artifact, but he absolutely wanted his family to have a Valyrian steel sword at almost any cost, and now one had just fallen into his lap. Tywin had been trying for years and years, since long before the events of A Song of Ice and Fire, to purchase a Valyrian steel blade from another house, without success. Thus, ice was the opportunity he had been waiting for. It was not only a chance to arm his heir, but a chance to arm his nephew, the king. By melting down ice into 2 swords, one smaller than the other, Tywin sought to match House Targaryen's famous pair of Blackfyre and Dark Sister. Blackfyre was wielded by Aegon the Conqueror, while Dark Sister was wielded by Visenya. Likewise, Tywin intended the larger sword for Jaime, the smaller for Joffrey. Of course, Tywin's plans were foiled when Jaime not only lost his hand, but refused to leave the Kingsguard. He then gave the sword to Brienne and told her to call it Oathkeeper. She would be charged with locating Ned Stark's daughter with Ned Stark's own steel. As we know, Brienne tries her best, but instead of finding Arya or Sansa, she finds their undead mother Catelyn, now called Lady Stoneheart. She is none too pleased at the sight of Oathkeeper, given its Lannister design, saying it should be called Oathbreaker instead. What happens with Jaime, Brienne, Stoneheart and the rest of the Brotherhood without banners is also a bit too much of a digression for this video, but it's certainly likely that the Oathkeeper half of Ice will continue to be used in the service of House Stark for the next while. Meanwhile, the other half of Ice, Widow's Wail, sits unused in the Red Keep. It passed from Joffrey to Tommen, but the young king is currently too small for it. He would presumably carry Widow's Wail regularly when he grows up, but the events of A Song of Ice and Fire may not grant Tommen many more years of life. Thus, the fate of Widow's Wail could be up in the air as well, and it's not hard to see it returning to the service of House Stark. On the TV show, Jamie ends up with that, and although it's harder to see how he might in the books, he has been struggling to learn to fight with his left hand, so perhaps a smaller, lighter sword is the answer. It is not a secret that Widow's Wail and Oathkeeper came from melting down ice, and traditionally Valyrian steel swords are not kept as prizes of war. They are treated more like family members and ransomed if not returned as a courtesy from one noble house to another. Therefore, if King's Landing falls and a new ruler there wants to curry favour with the Starks, if they are then back in power in the north, they could do worse than gift Widow's Wail back to them. Thus it remains entirely possible that House Stark will receive one or both swords back into their possession, even if we don't yet know how. If it does turn out to be both, then they would have the option to reforge ice itself. Tobbo Mott still survives, and there are other Cahoric smiths out there capable as well, and Gendry, of course, trained under Tobbo Mott. What might he have learned about smithing Valyrian steel? Imagine him being given the two swords with the order to put them back together again. It could happen that ice is reforged from one of Widow's Wail or Oathkeeper alongside some different Valyrian steel blade, like Longclaw or Dark Sister, or perhaps forged entirely anew without either of its former halves. There have been at least 2 versions of ice, so why not a third? Because there are hints that ice's connection to the Starks is more magical and permanent than you might expect from a normal family heirloom. When Tywin ordered its reforging into 2 separate swords, he gave instructions that the steel be dyed a crimson red to suit House Lannister's colours. But when Tyrion looks at it, the colours are strange. He commented as he turned the blade in the sunlight. Most Valyrian steel was a grey so dark it looked almost black, as was true here as well, but blended into the folds was a red as deep as the grey. The 2 colours lapped over one another without ever touching, each ripple distinct, like waves of night and blood upon some steely shore. How did you get this patterning? I've never seen anything like it. Nor I, my lord, said the armourer. I confess, these colours were not what I intended, and I do not know that I could duplicate them. Your lord father had asked for the crimson of your house, and that was the colour I set out to infuse into the metal. But Valyrian steel is stubborn. These old swords remember, it is said, and they do not change easily. I worked 100 spells and brightened the red time and time again, but always the colour would darken, as if the blade was drinking the sun from it, and some folds would not take the red at all. A reminder there that Valyrian steel is made with magic, and it did not want to change. It remembered. Which does bring us to one symbolic contrast that stands out in the books, between the dark, almost black Stark sword and the milky white sword Dawn, held by House Dane. Though Dawn is not Valyrian steel, it is forged from a mysterious metal that is just as light, and it is ancient, thousands of years old, perhaps even as old as the first Long Night, like the original sword Ice. And though, as far as we know, Ned left Ice at Winterfell during Robert's rebellion, he did come up against Dawn, wielded by the legendary Sir Arthur Dane during his last stand at the Tower of Joy. As it is dark and smoky, Ice would have made for quite a stirring image if it had clashed with Dawn, the dark, infernal blade versus the pale, celestial one. Ned's fever dream of it has his companions as grey wraiths with shadow swords set against the white-cloaked knights with Arthur Dane holding aloft Dawn, its blade as pale as milk glass, alive with light. The imagery is unsettling. Surely the Starks are the good guys. Or is it just that their sword is darker? Let's go back to that early image we had of Ned cleaning Ice underneath the weirwood tree. Ned clearly finds the godswood a comfortable place where he can be at one with himself and the old gods, but we see it from Kat's perspective, and the language is actually quite sinister. It is dark and miserable, she thinks. It smells of decay with misshapen roots. It has deep silence and brooding shadows. The weirwood's bark is white as bone, its leaves dark red like 1,000 blood-stained hands. Not a pleasant place, to say the least. And the water Ned is cleaning Ice with? Black and cold, we're told. And when you think of it, is there something even deeper going on? He has just performed an execution, a sacrifice, then took his sword back to wash that blood off in the waters beneath the weirwood tree. and this seems to have happened for generations, passed on father to son for millennia. Justice dispensed by ice, and then the blood sacrifice offered to the weirwood tree. But what do you think is going on with ice? Would you prefer to see ice reforged, or is it better to have 2 Valyrian steel blades for House Stark, particularly when it comes to fighting the others? Let me know in the comments below. If you'd like to see more videos like this, diving deep into the world of Ice and Fire, there's a link to my playlist appearing now on the left of your screen. Or to support this channel, thank you. There's a link to my Patreon page on the right of your screen. That's all for this time. Thanks for watching. I'll see you again soon.